The morning sun spilled through the wide windows of Miller's Diner on 5th Street, casting long shadows across the checkered floor and glinting off the polished chrome of the counter. It was a Wednesday, the day the entire staff dreaded when the air in the diner grew thick with tension long before the first customer arrived. The regulars, a mix of truck drivers, retirees, and office workers grabbing a quick coffee, chatted in low murmurs, their voices blending with the clink of cutlery and the sizzle of bacon from the kitchen. But at precisely 7:45 a.m., the bell above the door chimed, and a hush fell over the room as if someone had flipped a switch. Edward Langston, the billionaire real estate tycoon whose name adorned half the buildings in town, strode in with the confidence of a man who owned the world. His tailored navy suit, crisp white shirt, and polished loafers screamed wealth, but it was his cold gray eyes and the slight sneer on his lips that made the staff scatter like leaves in a storm. Sophie, the young waitress, with a nervous smile, suddenly found an urgent need to polish the already spotless coffee machine. Ben, the grizzled cook, who'd seen 30 years behind the grill, muttered something about checking the inventory and disappeared into the back. Even Mrs. Callahan, the diner's owner, who prided herself on greeting every customer with a warm smile, busied herself with paperwork at the register, her eyes fixed downward. Edward, oblivious or indifferent to the chaos his presence caused, made his way to his usual corner booth, the one with the best view of the street, and sat down with a heavy thud, his fingers already drumming impatiently on the table. Clara Thompson, the newest addition to Miller's Diner, watched this scene unfold from behind the counter, her hands steady as she wiped down a stack of coffee mugs. At 58, Clara had a quiet strength about her, the kind forged through years of hard work and harder lessons. Her dark hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back in a neat bun, and her apron was tied with the precision of someone who took pride in the small details. She'd only been at the diner for 4 days, still learning the rhythm of the morning rush, but she'd worked enough service jobs, diners, bars, truck stops, to recognize the unspoken rules of any workplace. There were always difficult customers, the ones who tested your patience, but Clara had never seen an entire staff react like this to one man. She caught Sophie's eye as the younger woman darted toward the supply closet, her face pale. "What's going on?" Clara asked, keeping her voice low. Sophie hesitated, glancing toward the corner booth, where Edward sat, his gaze fixed on his phone. "That's Edward Langston," she whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she refilled a sugar dispenser for the second time. "He comes in every Wednesday, and just let someone else take his table, okay? Trust me." Clara raised an eyebrow, intrigued rather than intimidated. "How bad can one guy be?" she asked, her tone light, but curious. Before Sophie could answer, Edward's voice cut through the diner like a blade. "Is anyone planning to serve me today, or should I make my own breakfast?" His words dripped with sarcasm, and the few customers at the counter shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending not to notice. Clara set down the mug she was cleaning and picked up a coffee pot and a menu, her movements calm and deliberate. She'd dealt with men like this before, men who thought money gave them the right to treat others like dirt. Back in her 20s, working at a truck stop in Tucson, she'd faced down truckers twice her size who thought they could bully her into submission. She'd learned early on that the only way to handle a bully was to stand your ground, not with anger, but with dignity. As she approached Edward's booth, she could feel the eyes of the diner on her, Sophie peeking from behind the counter, Ben watching cautiously from the kitchen pass through, even the regulars pausing mid-bite to see what would happen. "Good morning," Clara said, her voice warm but firm, as she set a coffee cup in front of him and began pouring. Coffee to start. Edward looked up, his eyes narrowing as if he were sizing her up. "You're new," he said, not as a question, but as an accusation, his tone carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed without hesitation. "Started Monday," Clara replied unfazed, placing the menu on the table. "What can I get you for breakfast?" He stared at her for a moment, clearly expecting her to wilt under his gaze. When she didn't, he leaned back in his seat, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "I want my usual," he said curtly. "And make sure it's quick. I don't have all day." Clara tilted her head slightly, her expression polite but unyielding. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't know what your usual is yet. Could you tell me what you'd like?" Edward's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. "Are you serious? I've been coming here for 7 years. Everyone knows my order." His voice rose slightly, drawing more attention from the nearby tables. Clara didn't flinch. "Well, I don't," she said, her tone still friendly but with a steel edge. "So, if you'd like to eat this morning, you'll need to tell me what you want." The diner went silent, the kind of silence that feels like the air has been sucked out of the room. Sophie froze mid-step, her eyes wide with panic. Ben's spatula hovered over the grill, and even Mrs. Callahan looked up from her paperwork, her mouth slightly agape. No one had ever spoken to Edward Langston like that, not at Miller's Diner, not in this town where his name was synonymous with power and influence. Edward's jaw tightened, his fingers stopping their impatient drumming. "Fine," he said, each word sharp enough to cut glass. 2 eggs, sunny side up, no runny whites. Sourdough toast, no butter. Hash browns extra crispy. Black coffee, fresh, not that swill you serve after it's been sitting for hours. And a glass of orange juice, freshly squeezed, not from a carton. Clara nodded, jotting down the order with the same calm precision she'd used to wipe down the mugs. "Coming right up," she said, turning to leave. "Wait!" Edward snapped, his voice loud enough to make a nearby customer jump. Clara turned back, her expression unchanged. "Is there something else you need?" she asked, her voice steady. Edward leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "I need you to understand something," he said, his tone low and deliberate. "My time is worth more than you'll earn in a decade. When I come in here, I expect service, not attitude." The words hung in the air, heavy and threatening. Clara could feel the weight of every gaze in the diner, the collective breath of the staff and customers waiting to see how she'd respond. She set the coffee pot down on the table, not out of anger but to free her hands, and looked Edward directly in the eyes. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and calm, "I gave you service. I took your order politely and accurately. I'm not sure what attitude you're referring to." Edward's face reddened, his hands clenching into fists. "Don't play dumb with me," he said. "I know who I am, and this town knows it too. You don't get to talk to me like I'm just another customer." Clara nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his words. "You know," she said, her voice softening but still firm, "in all my years of waitressing, I've noticed something. The people who feel the need to tell others how important they are, they're usually not as important as they think." A collective gasp rippled through the diner. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, and Ben let out a low whistle from the kitchen. Even the regulars, who usually kept their heads down during Edward's visits, couldn't hide their shock. No one had ever dared to challenge Edward Langston so directly. Not here, not anywhere in a town where his real estate empire funded schools, hospitals, and even the mayor's annual gala. Edward stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor, his 6-foot frame towering over Clara. For a moment, it seemed he might explode, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Clara didn't step back. "Someone who's hungry for breakfast." "I assume," she said, her tone matter of fact, "unless you'd prefer to leave. I won't take it personally." The diner was so quiet, you could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the back. Edward's hands trembled slightly, whether from rage or something else Clara couldn't tell. For a long moment, he stood there, his eyes locked on hers, as if waiting for her to back down. When she didn't, he sat back down heavily, his shoulders slumping just a fraction. "Bring me my breakfast," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier venom. "And make sure it's right." Clara nodded, picking up the coffee pot and heading toward the kitchen. As she clipped the order to the wheel, Ben leaned through the pass-through, his eyes wide with a mix of admiration and disbelief. "Clara, do you know what you just did?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Treated a customer like a person instead of a king," she replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Ben shook his head, his grizzled face breaking into a grin. "That's Edward Langston. He owns half this town, has dinner with the governor, funds the children's hospital. Nobody talks to him like that." Clara glanced back at the corner booth where Edward sat staring out the window, his posture less commanding than before, almost deflated. "Well," she said, "maybe it's time someone did." As she returned to the counter to check on her other tables, she noticed the regulars whispering among themselves, their glances darting between her and Edward. Sophie crept out from the supply closet, her face still pale, but her eyes bright with curiosity. "Clara, how did you do that?" she whispered. "Weren't you scared?" Clara paused, thinking back to a moment years ago when she was 22, standing behind a counter in Tucson, facing a trucker who thought he could intimidate her into giving him a free meal. She'd been scared then, her hands shaking as she stood her ground, but she'd learned something that day: fear only wins if you let it. "I was scared once," she told Sophie, her voice soft but steady. "But I learned a long time ago that respect isn't something you owe someone just because they're rich or powerful. It's something you earn." As Clara moved through the diner, refilling coffee cups and clearing plates, she kept an eye on Edward. He wasn't scrolling through his phone or barking orders like she'd expected. Instead, he was watching the street outside where a group of school children crossed the road, their laughter faint through the glass. There was something in his expression, something almost wistful, that made Clara pause. She'd seen that look before on her mother's face late at night, after a double shift at the factory, when she'd talk about the dreams she'd had before life wore them down. "Sophie," Clara said, turning to the younger waitress, "what's his story? Why's everyone so afraid of him?" Sophie hesitated, glancing toward Edward's booth. "He's intense," she said. "He's got this reputation. If you cross him, he can make your life miserable. Last year, he got the manager at the bakery down the street fired just because his coffee was cold. And he's got money, Clara. Like more money than anyone in this town. People say he could buy Miller's Diner and turn it into a parking lot if he wanted." Clara nodded, absorbing the information. "Sounds like a man who's used to getting his way," she said. "But nobody gets their way forever." As she carried Edward's breakfast to his table, 2 eggs, sunny-side-up sourdough toast. Dry hash browns? Extra crispy. She made sure every detail was perfect. Ben had outdone himself, the eggs cooked to a precise golden hue. The hash browns crisp enough to crunch with every bite. "Here you go," Clara said, setting the plate down. "Everything looked right." Edward glanced at the food, then back at her, his expression unreadable. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" he asked suddenly, his voice quieter than before, almost curious. Clara paused, the coffee pot still in her hand. It was such an unexpected question from a man who'd been throwing his weight around just minutes earlier. "Should I be?" she asked, meeting his gaze. "Everyone else is." He gestured vaguely toward the counter where Sophie was pretending to organize napkins. "They scatter like roaches when I walk in." Clara set the coffee pot down and leaned slightly closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Maybe they're not afraid of you," she said. Maybe they're just tired of being treated like they don't matter. Edward's fork froze halfway to his mouth, his eyes narrowing as if he were seeing her for the first time. "You don't know me," he said, but there was less venom in his voice now, more uncertainty. "I don't need to," Clara replied. "I know people, and I know that nobody's too big to treat others with a little decency." Before Edward could respond, Clara turned to check on her other tables, leaving him to his breakfast. The diner slowly came back to life, the regulars resuming their conversations, the clink of dishes filling the air once more. But Clara could feel Edward's eyes on her as she moved through the room, refilling coffee and chatting with customers. When she glanced back at his booth, he was eating slowly, his gaze fixed on the plate, as if it held answers he hadn't expected to find. As the morning rush wound down, Edward finished his meal and stood leaving a crisp $100 bill on the table, far more than the cost of his breakfast. He didn't say a word as he left, but Clara noticed the way his shoulders slumped slightly, the way his steps lacked their earlier swagger. As the bell chimed behind him, Sophie rushed over, her eyes wide. "Clara, you're insane," she said, half laughing, half awestruck. "I thought he was going to fire us all on the spot." Clara smiled, picking up the $100 bill and slipping it into the tip jar to be split among the staff. "Money doesn't scare me," she said, "and neither does he." As she cleared Edward's table, Clara thought about her mother, who'd worked as a seamstress in a factory for 30 years, coming home with calloused hands and a stubborn pride that no amount of hardship could break. "Never let anyone make you feel small," her mother had told her once, her voice fierce, despite her exhaustion. "Not a boss, not a customer, not anyone." Clara had carried those words with her through every job, every challenge, every moment when the world tried to push her down. And as she looked out the window, watching Edward's black sedan pull away, she had a feeling this wasn't the last time she'd see him. Something told her this breakfast was just the beginning of something bigger, something that might change not just Edward Langston, but the entire rhythm of Miller's Diner. The following Wednesday, the air at Miller's Diner on 5th Street carried a different kind of tension, a quiet anticipation that buzzed beneath the usual clatter of plates and the hum of morning conversations. The regulars, sipping their coffee at the counter, kept stealing glances toward the door, waiting for the inevitable chime of the bell that would announce Edward Langston's arrival. Last week's showdown between the Billionaire and Clara Thompson, the new waitress, had spread through the town like wildfire, whispered over grocery store aisles and recounted in the barber shop down the street. Sophie, the young waitress, with a nervous habit of twisting her apron strings, was wiping down the counter with more vigor than necessary, her eyes darting between the clock and the door. Ben the cook stood at the grill, flipping pancakes with a precision that belied the way he kept one ear tuned to the front of the diner. Even Mrs. Callahan, the owner, lingered near the register, pretending to organize receipts, but clearly watching for what would happen next. Clara, however, moved through her tasks with the same steady calm she'd shown since her first day refilling sugar dispensers and chatting with a trucker about the weather. At 58, she'd learned to trust her instincts, and something told her that Edward Langston wasn't done with Miller's Diner, or with her. At exactly 7:45 a.m., the bell chimed, and Edward strode in his navy suit, as impeccable as ever, his silver hair catching the morning light. But there was something different about him today, a slight hesitation in his step, a flicker of curiosity in his cold gray eyes as they scanned the diner and landed on Clara. The staff didn't scatter quite as quickly as they had the week before, though Sophie still found an urgent need to check the coffee filters, and Ben's spatula slowed its rhythm. Edward made his way to his usual corner booth, his movements less commanding, almost deliberate, as if he were testing the waters. Clara noticed the change, but didn't dwell on it. She grabbed the coffee pot and a menu, her apron swaying slightly as she crossed the diner. "Good morning, Mr. Langston," she said, her voice warm but professional, as she set a cup in front of him and poured. "Coffee to start." Edward looked up, his expression unreadable but lacking the sharp edge of last week's encounter. "You remembered my name?" he said, his tone somewhere between surprise and suspicion. "It's my job to know my customers," Clara replied, placing the menu on the table. "What can I get you today?" He leaned back, studying her. "You're not going to make me repeat my order again, are you?" he asked, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, though it lacked the venom of before. Clara smiled unfazed. "I've got it memorized now. 2 eggs sunny side up, no runny whites. Sourdough toast, no butter. Hash browns, extra crispy. Black coffee, fresh. Orange juice, freshly squeezed." "Sound right?" Edward's smirk softened into something closer to approval. "Exactly right," he said, then added almost as an afterthought, "And make it quick. I have a meeting at 9. Clara nodded, jotting down the order even though she didn't need to, and turned toward the kitchen. But before she could take a step, Edward's voice stopped her. "Wait," he said, quieter this time, almost hesitant. She turned back, raising an eyebrow. "Something else?" she asked. He hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly on the table, a nervous habit that seemed out of place for a man who exuded control. "Why did you do that last week?" he asked. "Talk to me like that! Most people would have just taken the order and kept their heads down." Clara set the coffee pot down on the table, her hands steady. "Because I've met men like you before," she said, her voice calm but direct. "Men who think they can walk over people just because they've got money or power. And I learned a long time ago that if you let someone treat you like you're nothing, they'll keep doing it." Edward's eyes narrowed, but there was no anger in them, only curiosity. "And where did you learn that?" he asked. Clara paused, her mind flashing back to a dusty diner in Tucson, where she'd worked nights to support her son after her husband's death. "Life," she said simply. "It's a good teacher if you pay attention." Before Edward could respond, the bell chimed again, and an older man shuffled in his worn jacket and baseball cap, marking him as a regular. Clara recognized him as Mr. Ellis, a retired accountant who came in every morning for oatmeal and a cup of decaf. He nodded at Clara, then froze when he saw Edward in the corner booth. "Well, I'll be damned," Mr. Ellis said, his voice loud enough to carry across the diner. "Edward Langston in the flesh. Didn't think I'd see you here after all these years." Edward's posture stiffened, his jaw tightening as he turned to face the older man. "Ellis," he said curtly, his tone clipped. "Didn't expect to see you either." Mr. Ellis chuckled undeterred and shuffled closer to the booth. "Oh, I bet you didn't. Last time we crossed paths, you were yelling at my nephew for spilling coffee on your precious suit. Poor kid was shaking for days." The diner grew quiet again, the regulars exchanging glances, sensing a story. Clara, standing nearby, watched Edward's face, noting the way his hands clenched around his coffee cup. "That was a long time ago," Edward said, his voice low, almost defensive. "Not that long," Mr. Ellis replied, his tone light, but pointed. "You always did have a temper, Langston. Made you a fortune, but cost you a few friends, didn't it?" Clara could see the discomfort in Edward's eyes, a crack in his polished facade. She stepped forward, her instincts kicking in. "Mr. Ellis?" she said, her voice warm but firm. "How about I get your oatmeal started?" "Same as usual." Mr. Ellis blinked, as if remembering where he was, and nodded. "Sure thing, Clara. You're a good one." As he shuffled to his usual seat at the counter, Clara turned back to Edward, who was staring at his coffee, his expression unreadable. "He's got a point," Edward said quietly, almost to himself. I don't have many friends left. Clara hesitated, then decided to take a chance. Maybe that's because you push people away before they get too close, she said, keeping her tone gentle. Edward looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment she saw something raw, something vulnerable beneath his usual arrogance. You don't know me, he said, but there was no bite in his words, only a quiet challenge. I don't need to, Clara replied. I know what it looks like when someone's carrying more than they let on. She turned to head to the kitchen, but Edward's voice stopped her again. What's your story, Clara? He asked, his tone softer now, almost curious. You're not like the others here. You don't flinch. Clara paused, her hand resting on the coffee pot. She wasn't one to share her life with strangers, but there was something about Edward's question, something genuine that made her answer. I raised a son on my own, she said, her voice steady but tinged with memory. My husband died in a car accident when I was 25. Left me with a 2-year-old and a pile of bills. I worked double shifts at a diner in Tucson, dealt with customers who thought they could yell at me because I was just a waitress. But I learned something back then. You don't let people walk over you no matter who they are. Because if you do, you start to believe you deserve it. Edward listened, his eyes fixed on her, his coffee untouched. And your son? He asked. Clara smiled faintly, a mix of pride and pain. He's grown now, works as a mechanic in Phoenix. Took after his dad, loves fixing things, but he learned from me that pride isn't something you borrow from someone else's opinion of you. It's something you build. Edward nodded slowly, as if her words were sinking in. Before he could say more, Clara headed to the kitchen to place his order, clipping it to the wheel with a quick nod to Ben. He's different today, Ben said, keeping his voice low as he cracked 2 eggs onto the grill. Not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Clara glanced back at Edward, who was staring out the window at the street where a group of kids were skateboarding past the diner. Maybe it's just a thing, she said. People aren't always what they seem. As she returned to her tables, she noticed Edward watching her, not with the cold scrutiny of last week, but with something closer to interest, maybe even respect. When she brought his breakfast eggs, perfectly sunny-side up, hash browns, crisp to perfection, he didn't inspect the plate like he usually did. Instead, he looked at her and said, "Thank you, Clara." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Sophie, who was eavesdropping nearby, nearly drop a tray of glasses. "Did he just say thank you?" she whispered to Clara as she passed. Clara nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Progress?" she said. As the morning rush continued, Clara moved through the diner, refilling coffee and clearing plates, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Edward. There was something about him, something beneath the arrogance and the tailored suits, that reminded her of her late husband, Daniel. Not in his demeanor, but in the way he carried a burden he didn't talk about. Daniel had been a quiet man, a carpenter who poured his heart into every piece of furniture he built, but he'd carried the weight of providing for a young family in a world that wasn't always kind. Clara had seen that same weight in Edward's eyes, a flicker of something unspoken, something that made him lash out to keep people at a distance. When she returned to his table to refill his coffee, he was staring at the skateboarders outside, his expression distant. "You ever skate?" he asked suddenly, catching her off guard. Clara laughed, surprised by the question. "Me? No, but my son used to drive me crazy with his skateboard, grinding on every curb he could find. Nearly broke his arm once." Edward's lips twitched, almost a smile. "I used to," he said, his voice quiet. "When I was a kid, grew up in a rough part of town, didn't have much. A skateboard was the only thing that made me feel free." Clara raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Hard to picture you on a skateboard," she said, keeping her tone light. Edward chuckled a low, rusty sound as if he hadn't laughed in years. "Hard to picture me as a kid at all, I bet," he said. "But I was. Poor as dirt, too. Had to fight for everything I got." Clara nodded, sensing an opening. "Must have been tough," she said. "But you made it out. Built something big." Edward's expression darkened, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. "Yeah, I built something," he said, "and lost a lot along the way. People don't tell you that part." He didn't elaborate, and Clara didn't push, but she filed the moment away, a piece of the puzzle that was Edward Langston. As she moved to her other tables, she noticed Mr. Ellis watching Edward from the counter, his eyes narrowed with a mix of curiosity and disapproval. When Clara brought him his oatmeal, he leaned in and whispered, "Be careful with that one, Clara. He's got a heart under all that bluster, but it's buried deep. Hurt a lot of people to get where he is." Clara nodded, her gaze drifting back to Edward, who was eating slowly, his eyes still fixed on the street outside. "Maybe," she said, "but sometimes people just need a little help digging it out." As the morning wore on, the diner buzzed with its usual rhythm, but there was a subtle shift in the air. The regulars were less tense, their conversations a little louder, as if Edward's quieter demeanor had loosened something in the room. When he finished his breakfast, he left another $100 bill on the table, but this time he added a small note on a napkin. "Good coffee." "Thanks, Clara." Sophie nearly fainted when she saw it, rushing over to show Clara as soon as Edward's sedan pulled away. "He wrote you a note," she said, her voice a mix of awe and disbelief. Clara smiled, tucking the napkin into her apron pocket. "It's just a note, Sophie," she said, but inside she felt a spark of hope. Edward Langston was a man used to controlling everything, his business, his image, his world. But today, for the first time, he'd let a crack show a glimpse into the boy he'd been, the man he might still become. As Clara cleared his table, she thought about her mother's words again. "Never let anyone make you feel small." But now she added her own, "And never let anyone think they're too big to change." She had a feeling Edward's story was far from over, and Miller's Diner was about to become the stage for something none of them expected. The weeks following Clara Thompson's bold encounters with Edward Langston at Miller's Diner on 5th Street brought a subtle shift to the Wednesday morning routine. The regulars who once braced themselves for the billionaire's arrival now watched with a mix of curiosity and cautious optimism. The bell above the door no longer triggered a mass exodus of staff. Instead, Sophie lingered a bit longer at the counter, and Ben the cook didn't vanish into the kitchen quite as quickly. Even Mrs. Callahan, the diner's owner, seemed less tense, occasionally glancing toward Edward's corner booth with something like hope. Clara, at 58, moved through her shifts with the same steady calm, her silver-streaked hair pulled back, her apron tied with precision. She'd seen enough of life to know that change didn't happen overnight, but the small cracks in Edward's armor, his thank yous, his fleeting moments of vulnerability hinted at something stirring beneath his polished exterior. By mid-November, Edward was coming to the diner not just on Wednesdays, but sometimes on Fridays or Mondays, his visits less predictable, but no less commanding. He still carried himself like a man who owned half the town, but there was a new quality to his presence, a quiet curiosity that seemed to linger on Clara and the world of the diner. On this particular Wednesday, the air was crisp with the first bite of autumn, and the diner smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon from Ben's morning batch of rolls. Clara was wiping down the counter when the bell chimed at 7:45 a.m., and Edward strode in his charcoal suit, impeccable, his gray eyes scanning the room. He nodded slightly to Mrs. Callahan, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed a month ago, and took his usual booth. Clara approached with the coffee pot, her smile warm but professional. "Good morning, Mr. Langston," she said, pouring his coffee. The usual Edward looked up, his expression softer than it had been weeks ago, though still guarded. "You know it by now, Clara," he said, his voice carrying a hint of warmth. "But make sure the hash browns are extra crispy. Last time they were a bit soft." Clara nodded, jotting down the order she'd memorized weeks ago. 2 eggs, sunny side up. No runny whites, sourdough toast, dry, hash browns, extra crispy black coffee, fresh orange juice. "Got it," she said, turning toward the kitchen. But as she walked away, she caught Edward watching her, not with his usual scrutiny, but with something closer to interest, as if he were trying to figure her out. The morning rush was in full swing, with regulars chatting over plates of pancakes and truckers nursing their coffee before hitting the road. Clara moved through her tables with ease, refilling cups and trading small talk, but she kept an eye on Edward. He was different today, less restless, his phone untouched on the table, as he stared out the window at the park across the street, where a group of kids were kicking a soccer ball. She wondered what he saw in those moments, what memories or regrets flickered behind those cold gray eyes. When she brought his breakfast, she set the plate down carefully, noting Ben's perfect execution of the eggs and hash browns. "Everything look right?" she asked. Edward glanced at the plate, then back at her. "Perfect," he said, and for the first time there was no edge to his voice, no hint of a challenge. Clara smiled, about to move on, when Edward spoke again, his voice low. "Clara, do you ever feel alone, even when you're surrounded by people?" The question caught her off guard, raw and unexpected from a man who seemed to thrive on distance. She set the coffee pot down, considering her answer. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "but I've learned that loneliness isn't about how many people are around you. It's about whether you let them in." Edward nodded slowly, his fork hovering over his eggs. "I've got hundreds of employees, a boardroom full of executives, people who jump when I call," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But most days it feels like I'm shouting into a void." Clara studied him, seeing the weight he carried, the same weight she'd seen in her late husband Daniel, when the pressures of providing for their family had worn him down. "Maybe it's not about shouting," she said gently. "Maybe it's about listening." Before Edward could respond, a commotion at the counter drew their attention. Sophie, her face flushed, was talking to a regular, an older woman named Mrs. Harper, who was gesturing animatedly. Clara excused herself and headed over, catching the tail end of their conversation. "I'm just saying, Sophie," Mrs. Harper was saying, her voice loud enough to carry, "it's a shame you have to work so many hours. A young thing like you should be out living, not stuck here until midnight, to pay for those college classes." Sophie smiled weakly, clearly embarrassed. "It's okay, Mrs. Harper. I manage." Clara stepped in, her voice calm but firm. "Sophie's tougher than she looks," she said, winking at the younger waitress. "She's going to be a great nurse someday." Mrs. Harper nodded, satisfied, and returned to her coffee. Clara pulled Sophie aside, lowering her voice. "You okay?" she asked. Sophie nodded, but her eyes were tired. "It's just hard," she admitted. "The tuition's more than I expected, and I'm picking up extra shifts to cover it. I don't want to let my mom down. She's so proud I got into nursing school." Clara squeezed her shoulder, her heart aching for the young woman who reminded her so much of herself at that age, juggling dreams and bills with no safety net. "You're doing great," Clara said, "and you're not alone." "Okay," Sophie nodded, managing a small smile before heading back to her tables. When Clara returned to Edward's booth to refill his coffee, she noticed he'd been watching the exchange, his expression unreadable. "She's working herself to death," he said, his voice low, almost as if he were talking to himself. Clara nodded, pouring the coffee. "She's got big dreams," she said. "But dreams don't come cheap." Edward looked down at his plate, his fork still in hand. "I used to have dreams like that," he said so quietly. Clara almost missed it. Thought if I worked hard enough, I'd prove everyone wrong. The kids who laughed at me for wearing second-hand clothes, the teachers who said I'd never amount to anything. Clara sat down across from him uninvited, a move that would have sent Sophie running for cover a month ago. "And you did prove them wrong," she said. "You built an empire." Edward's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Yeah. And what did it cost me? My sister won't speak to me. My oldest friend stopped calling years ago. I'm 55 years old, Clara, and the only people who stay around me are the ones I pay." The rawness of his words hit Clara like a wave stirring memories of her own losses. Her husband, gone too soon. The years of struggling alone, the nights when she wondered if she'd made the right choices. "You know," she said, her voice soft but steady, "my son Michael went through a phase where he wouldn't take help from anyone. Not me, not his teachers, not even his friends. Said he had to do it on his own, prove he was strong enough. Nearly broke himself trying. But one day he let me buy him a new pair of work boots when his old ones fell apart. And you know what? The world didn't end. He didn't stop being strong. Sometimes letting someone in is the strongest thing you can do." Edward listened, his eyes fixed on her, his breakfast forgotten. "You think I'm like that?" he asked. Too proud to let anyone close, Clara shrugged a small smile tugging at her lips. "I think you're human," she said. "And humans need other humans, whether they admit it or not." Before Edward could respond, the bell chimed, and a group of construction workers piled in their laughter, filling the diner. Clara stood grabbing the coffee pot. "Duty calls," she said, leaving Edward to his thoughts. As she moved through the diner, she noticed him watching her again, his gaze lingering not just on her but on the rhythm of the place. The way Sophie bantered with the regulars, the way Ben called out orders with a grin, the way Mrs. Callahan slipped a free muffin to a kid who came in with his mom. When Clara returned to clear his plate, Edward was staring out the window again, but this time his expression was different, less distant, more contemplative. "You're good at this," he said suddenly, "making people feel seen." Clara smiled, stacking his dishes. "It's not hard," she said. "You just have to pay attention." As the morning wound down, Clara was wiping down the counter when Sophie rushed over, her eyes wide. "Clara, you're not going to believe this," she whispered, holding out a folded napkin. "He left this with his tip." Clara unfolded the napkin, revealing another $100 bill and a note in Edward's neat handwriting for Sophie's tuition. "Don't tell her it's from me." Clara's breath caught her heart swelling with a mix of surprise and pride. She glanced at Edward's empty booth, then back at Sophie. "Well, look at that," she said, slipping the bill into the tip jar, but keeping the note. "Someone's looking out for you." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and she hugged Clara, her voice trembling. "I don't know who did this, but thank you for telling me I'm not alone." Clara hugged her back, her thoughts drifting to Edward. He'd done something kind, something selfless, and he didn't want credit for it. It was a small act, but to Clara it was a sign of something bigger, a crack in the wall he'd built around himself, letting a little light through. Later that day, as the lunch crowd thinned, Clara noticed Edward lingering outside the diner, standing by the park across the street. He wasn't on his phone or rushing to his car like usual. Instead, he was watching the soccer game, his hands in his pockets, a faint smile on his face. Clara stepped outside the cool air brushing her skin and crossed the street to join him. "Enjoying the view?" she asked, nodding toward the kids. Edward glanced at her, startled, then relaxed. "Reminds me of when I was their age," he said. "No money, no worries, just a ball and a patch of grass." Clara nodded, sensing the weight behind his words. "You ever miss it?" she asked. Edward was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the game. Every day, he said finally. But I didn't know it until recently. Clara didn't push, but she felt a shift in the air between them, a bridge forming where there'd once been a wall. You know, she said, her voice gentle, you don't have to stay stuck in who you've been. You can choose who you want to be. Edward didn't respond, but as Clara turned to head back to the diner, she caught the faintest nod from him, a silent acknowledgement that her words had landed. Back inside the diner buzzed with its usual warmth, but Clara felt a spark of hope. Edward Langston was waking up not just to the world around him, but to the possibility of change. And as she poured coffee for a new customer, she thought about her son Michael and the boots she'd bought him all those years ago. Sometimes the smallest gestures, a pair of boots, a $100 bill, a kind word, could start a ripple that changed everything. She had a feeling Edward's ripple was just beginning, and Miller's Diner was about to see a side of him no one had expected. 6 months had passed since Clara Thompson first stood her ground against Edward Langston at Miller's Diner on 5th Street, and the once dreaded Wednesday mornings had transformed into something almost magical. The regulars no longer tensed when the bell above the door chimed at 7:45 a.m. Instead, they exchanged knowing smiles as if privy to a secret unfolding. Sophie, the young waitress, now greeted customers with a confidence that belied her earlier nervousness, her apron strings no longer twisted into knots. Ben, the grizzled cook, hummed old jazz tunes as he flipped pancakes, occasionally tossing a wink toward the corner booth where Edward sat. Mrs. Callahan, the diner's owner, had taken to leaving small notes of encouragement for her staff, inspired by the quiet changes she'd witnessed. Clara, now 59 and recently promoted to manager, moved through the diner with the same steady grace, her silver-streaked hair catching the morning light as she refilled coffee cups and traded stories with customers. Edward's visits had become a fixture not just on Wednesdays, but several days a week, his charcoal suits and polished loafers no longer a symbol of intimidation, but a familiar part of the diner's rhythm. The man who once silenced the room with his presence now nodded to regulars called the staff by name, and even laughed a rusty, genuine sound that still surprised those who heard it. On this chilly April morning, the diner buzzed with the warmth of spring's first promise, the air scented with fresh coffee and the faint sweetness of Ben's homemade biscuits. Clara was behind the counter training a new busboy when the bell chimed and Edward walked in his suit, a deep navy that contrasted with the soft light in his gray eyes. But today, he wasn't alone. A young woman in her late 20s with auburn hair and a nervous smile followed him, clutching a leather portfolio. The diner's hum softened as curious eyes turned toward the pair. Edward guided the woman to his usual corner booth, his posture relaxed but purposeful, and Clara felt a spark of curiosity. She grabbed the coffee pot and 2 menus, her apron swaying as she approached. "Good morning, Mr. Langston," she said, pouring coffee into 2 cups. "And good morning to your friend." Coffee to start. The young woman looked up, startled, then nodded. "Yes, please," she said, her voice soft but clear. Edward gestured toward her. "Clara, this is Jennifer Hayes," he said, his tone carrying a warmth that had become more common over the months. "She's interviewing to be my new assistant. I told her she has to pass the diner test first." Clara raised an eyebrow, a smile tugging at her lips. "The diner test?" she asked, setting the menus down. Jennifer glanced between them, clearly puzzled. "Mr. Langston said anyone who wants to work for him needs to handle breakfast here first," she explained, a nervous laugh escaping her. "Something about seeing if I can keep up with him." Clara chuckled, catching Edward's eye. "That's a new one?" she said. "How's he doing so far?" "Jennifer?" The young woman hesitated, then smiled. "Well, he held the door for me, asked about my family, and said, 'Please,' when he ordered coffee. I'm cautiously optimistic. Edward's cheeks flushed slightly, a rare hint of embarrassment, and Clara laughed outright, the sound drawing smiles from nearby tables. "Sounds like progress," she said. "What can I get started for you both?" Edward ordered his usual 2 eggs, sunny side up, no runny whites, sourdough toast, dry hash browns, extra crispy fresh orange juice, while Jennifer opted for a blueberry muffin and tea. As Clara headed to the kitchen, she felt a warmth in her chest. Edward was changing not just in small gestures, but in ways that rippled outward, touching everyone around him. When she clipped the order to the wheel, Ben leaned through the pass-through, his eyes twinkling. "He brought a guest," he said, flipping an egg with a flourish. "Never thought I'd see the day." Clara nodded, glancing back at the booth, where Edward was explaining something to Jennifer, his hands animated but gentle. "He's learning," she said, "one breakfast at a time." As the morning rush unfolded, Clara moved through the diner, her attention split between her tables and the scene at Edward's booth. Jennifer was jotting notes in her portfolio, nodding as Edward spoke, but there was an ease between them that Clara hadn't expected. She remembered Edward's confession months ago about his assistants quitting about the loneliness that gnawed at him despite his wealth. Now he seemed determined to do things differently. When Clara brought their food, she caught a snippet of their conversation, Edward talking about his company's latest project, a community center for low-income families. "It's not just about buildings," he was saying. "It's about giving people a place to belong." Jennifer nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's inspiring, Mr. Langston," she said. "I'd love to help make that happen." Clara set the plates down, her heart swelling. "Sounds like a good match," she said, winking at Jennifer. Edward looked up, his eyes meeting Clara's, and for a moment she saw gratitude there, unspoken but clear. The diner hummed with its usual energy, but Clara noticed Edward engaging with others in ways he never had before. When Sophie passed by, he asked about her nursing classes, listening intently as she shyly shared her latest exam results. When Mr. Ellis, the retired accountant, shuffled in for his oatmeal, Edward waved him over, offering to buy his breakfast. "No need to bring up old grudges," Edward said, his tone light but sincere. Mr. Ellis chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a different man these days, Langston," he said, accepting the offer. Clara watched from the counter, her hands busy with coffee refills, but her mind on Edward. She thought of her son Michael and the stubborn pride that had nearly broken him until he learned to accept help. Edward was walking a similar path, one step at a time, and she felt a quiet pride in being part of it. As the morning wound down, Edward approached the counter, Jennifer in tow, and handed Clara an envelope. "For you," he said, his voice low but firm. "And the staff. Open it later." Clara raised an eyebrow, but nodded, tucking the envelope into her apron. "You're full of surprises today," she said. Edward smiled, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You started it, Clara," he said. "I'm just trying to keep up." After he and Jennifer left, Clara opened the envelope, finding a check for $5,000 and a note for the staff. "You've made this place a home." "Thank you." Sophie, peering over her shoulder, gasped. "Is that for us?" she asked, her eyes wide. Clara nodded, her throat tight. "For all of us," she said, slipping the check to Mrs. Callahan, who immediately began planning a staff bonus. That evening, Clara attended an event she never thought she'd see, a charity gala hosted by Edward's company at the town's community center. He'd invited the entire diner staff, a gesture that had Sophie buzzing with excitement, and Ben grumbling about having to wear a tie. The center was a sleek, modern building, its walls lined with photos of local families it would serve. Clara, in a simple blue dress, felt out of place among the town's elite, but Edward greeted her at the entrance, his suit as sharp as ever, but his demeanor warm. "You came," he said, his voice tinged with relief. I wasn't sure you would. Clara smiled, smoothing her dress. Couldn't miss seeing what you've been up to, she said. As they walked through the crowd, Edward introduced her to colleagues, calling her the woman who changed everything. Clara laughed, brushing off the compliment, but she felt the weight of his words. At the podium, Edward gave a speech, his voice steady but emotional, thanking the diner staff for teaching him what it means to build a community. I used to think success was about money and power, he said, his eyes finding Clara in the crowd. But I've learned it's about the people you lift up along the way. Later, as the gala wound down, Edward pulled Clara aside, his expression serious. I need your help with something, he said, handing her a folded letter. It's for my sister Ellen. We haven't spoken in 10 years. I said things I shouldn't have, and she walked away. I don't know how to fix it. Clara took the letter, her heart aching for the vulnerability in his voice. What do you want to say? She asked. Edward hesitated, his hands fidgeting. That I'm sorry, he said. That I miss her, that I'm trying to be better. Clara nodded, opening the letter to find a draft filled with crossed-out lines and raw, honest words. This is a good start, she said. But let's make it simple. Just tell her the truth. Together, they rewrote the letter, Clara guiding him to strip away the defenses and speak from the heart. When they finished, Edward's eyes were misty. You're too good at this, he said, managing a smile. Clara shook her head. I just know what it's like to lose someone you love, she said, thinking of her husband Daniel and the years she'd wished for one more conversation. A week later, Edward returned to the diner, his face alight with something Clara hadn't seen before: hope. She called, he said, sliding into his booth. Ellen. She got the letter. We're meeting next week. Clara poured his coffee, her smile wide. That's wonderful, Edward, she said, using his first name for the first time. He didn't correct her. As she brought his breakfast, he told her about the call, how Ellen had cried, how they'd laughed about old memories, how she'd agreed to visit. I don't know if we'll ever be close again, he said. But it's a start. Clara nodded, her heart full. That's all anyone can ask for, she said, a chance to start over. By summer, Miller's Diner had become a different place. Edward's generosity had funded raises for the staff, and he'd started a scholarship program for local students inspired by Sophie's nursing dreams. Sophie, now halfway through her program, beamed with pride, her confidence growing with every shift. Ben, ever the skeptic, admitted he looked forward to Edward's visits, even joking about teaching him to flip pancakes. Mrs. Callahan hung a photo of the staff behind the counter. Edward included a testament to the family they'd become. Clara, now managing the diner, found herself reflecting on her own journey, the years of struggle, the loss of Daniel, the pride of raising Michael. She'd always believed in standing her ground, but she hadn't expected to help someone like Edward find his. One Tuesday, as the morning rush slowed, Edward lingered at his booth, a small notebook in hand. Clara approached, curious. What's that? She asked, nodding toward the notebook. Edward hesitated, then slid it across the table. A list, he said. People I owe apologies to. It's longer than I'd like. Clara scanned the names, former employees, business partners, even a childhood friend. This is brave, she said, handing it back. But you know the best apology isn't words, right? It's what you do next. Edward nodded, his expression serious. I'm trying, he said. You taught me that. As he left, he stopped at the kitchen window where Ben was plating an order. Ben, breakfast was perfect, he said. Thank you. Ben grinned, tossing a spatula in the air. See you next week, Langston, he called. Clara watched Edward cross the street to the park, where he sat on a bench next to Mr. Ellis, the two men sharing a bag of birdseed as they fed the pigeons. The sight brought a lump to her throat. She thought of her mother's words, "Never let anyone make you feel small," and her own addition, "And never let anyone think they're too big to change." Edward Langston had been a man defined by his wealth and temper, but now he was something more, a man learning to be human again. As Clara turned back to the diner, she felt a quiet certainty that the smallest acts of courage, like standing up to a billionaire or writing a letter to a lost sister, could spark a change that echoed far beyond the walls of Miller's diner. And in that moment, she knew her own story, like Edward's, was far from over.